Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, we've one more important presentation of this set of presentations to do with how to keep safe in any emergency, but certainly in a flood emergency in particular. I'm going to give a talk about manual handling, and I'm going to touch on some other safety issues as well. And Mick is still here from Highways, and Mick will keep me right and chip in if I've missed anything. Now, when we talk about manual handling, we're talking about lifting and lowering and carrying and pushing and pulling things. So what I'm going to say now applies as much to your everyday life as it does to in an emergency. It's the sort of thing which, if you're performing these actions incorrectly or excessively, then the task could expose you to the risk of injury, can lead to damaged muscles and strains and tensions, and affect ligaments and nerves and blood vessels. So you need to do this carefully. I'm going to give you 10 top tips during the course of the presentation, so I hope you'll find them useful. And I will also go on to emphasise some of the points that Fraser's made and touch on some of the other safety issues. Now, road closure wardens are acting on behalf of the County Council, and so part of that deal to allow you to do that is to attend this training. At the end of this session, as you leave this room, could I ask you all to make sure you do sign the form and make sure your neighbours sign the form, because we need to keep a record of who has been trained so that you've got, you're covered by the County Council's insurance if you're involved in any road traffic accident or other related to a future flood emergency when the closure scheme is in usage. Now, those of you who participated in the previous training or the practical session a moment ago, you'll have seen that the signs themselves are not very heavy. Mick made the point, though, that if it is blowing a gale, then they can become awkward to use, and if you get a force of wind behind them, they can be difficult to handle. So you have to take care with that. If it is windy, you may very well want to use a sandbag to drape across the arm of the sign at the back to give it some stability, and so it will stay upright in the wind and do its job to warn traffic. So you may well be handling sandbags. So from the County Council's point of view, that's probably the most strenuous thing we're going to be asking you to do. The cones, those of you who volunteered to help me lift the cones across, you know that individually they're not very heavy, but they do stack, and I saw one or two of you doing 2 or 3 or 4 together, and then they do get a bit heavy. And if you're lugging those very far, you could have to take care. Tip number 1 of my 10 tips is to know your limits. We're all very different, and please do think consciously about what you're taking on. So know your limits is tip number 1. Now, in any emergency, you might find yourself in an unusual, unfamiliar and possibly hostile environment. And from the County Council's point of view and our road closure scheme, we're absolutely not asking yourself to put yourself in any danger whatsoever. Faced with a difficult and potentially dangerous situation, you're asked to pause, take stock, and consider what needs to be done. So top tip number 2, do a risk assessment. Ask yourself, what could happen here? What are the dangers? And how do you reduce the risk? So do a risk assessment. Now, turning to the practicalities of manual handling, about lifting, think about how you're going to lift something before you start to pick it up. Get into a good posture. As the slide says, think about a boxer's stance. One thing you'll notice about a boxer when they're in the boxing ring is that their knees will be bent. And that is tip number 3 for any manual handling: bend your knees. So as you start to lift, again, keep thinking about your posture. You have to think about where you're lifting from, where you're lifting to, and the distance you've got to travel. So tip number 4, make a plan before you start. And that leads straight into number 5, use mechanical aids if you possibly can. So if you have a trolley, a wheelbarrow or something else to enable you to transfer the weight more easily, tip 5 is use mechanical aids. Now once you've lifted the load, again try and keep a mind on your posture. Think about how you're carrying the load. Keep it close to your body. Keep elbows tucked in and so on. Keep it near to the centre of your gravity. And as a little picture in the corner shows, top tip number 6, keep your head up. Now, you have to think about what it is you are lifting. Does it have sharp edges? Do you need to think about protecting your hands? Is it heavy, and if you dropped it on your toe, would you know about it? So tip number 7 is to wear suitable clothing. You may want to wear gloves or certainly stout shoes. So, having lifted it, and you might at this point be regretting lifting it or regretting not planning your move a bit more, but if you're in this situation, one thing you might want to think about is if you were going to, instead of lifting, if you wanted to push or pull, tip number 8 is that it's better and safer to push something than to pull it. And straight into number 9 is avoid twisting or leaning, as the lower back really isn't able or designed to cope with repetition of twists under this sort of load. So those are the top 9. The number 10 is about getting some practice at this. I'm giving you some of the theory, but number 10 is to get some practical training. You might want to try and practice this at home, put it into practice and see how it feels, but ideally attend some physical practical training. Those of you who've attended this talk before, when John Nyland has delivered it, he talks about the acronym TILE, task, individual, load, environment. Something to sort of think about as part of your risk assessment. What is it you're trying to do? What is the task? Is it going to be repetitive? Is it something you're familiar with? Are you doing it under time pressures, or can you plan ahead? Think about yourself. How experienced are you at this work? Physically conditioned to the task? What else is going on in the environment? Are you being distracted by other things? The weight itself, the load, can you get a good grip? How heavy is it? How stable is the ground you're working in? And beyond that, the general environment. Cold, is it wet, uneven ground, and what time of the day is it? Have you got good light to work in? That all feeds into your risk assessment to help you to keep yourself safe. I'll say a few words about sandbags. There are alternatives which I'm sure you know about, and you probably do know about the sort of weight they can become. So you want to reduce the load, not overfill an individual sandbag. If possible, again, lone working, try not to do this all on your own, have 2 people there. If you've got things you can use like a trolley to move things around, help lift them up, then please do, and have them pre-positioned where you can so that they're handy when you need them. You know that a modest wall of sandbags, say 10 sandbags, can be pretty heavy. They're heavy to start with just dry weight. When you double it to make it wet, you see that the move you're going to make soon becomes a considerable weight when you're dealing with wet sandbags. Aquasac's much better, the dry materials in Aquasac's, but again, you can quickly accumulate quite a weight once they are wet. Now this slide contains a whole range of topics you can put into your risk assessment. Looking around the environment, thinking about all the things that you might find that could give rise to risk. I won't go through them all individually. Some of these you've heard about already. Leptospirosis we'll come back to say a word about again later on. But those are the sorts of things you need to be looking for with your risk assessment. And you're going to be looking to try and reduce risk where you can. You may not be able to eliminate the hazard, might not be much you can do to reduce it, but you can then start to prevent contact. Safe systems of working, this is about avoiding contamination, for example, wearing PPE so you've got the correct sort of footwear on and gloves and so on. So those are the sort of things you need to be mindful of to try and reduce the risk that you're exposing yourself to. I want to elaborate a little on the themes that Fraser was covering when we're looking at the specific area where you are going to be closing a road. When you're doing your specific risk assessment, I know many of you have done this already, we've done it when we've walked around already, it needs to be under continual review. Look at your area, identify key hazards. We've already talked about putting them onto maps, which is exactly what we need to do. Note reference points, keep a record, take some photographs and so on, because this is exactly the sort of thing that we know is around and about in Southwell, and that's one of those slides that Fraser used to illustrate how different it can look in a flood emergency. So exactly as you've described, you're making a note of these on your map so you're ready when you go out in a future emergency. You know where the drain is, so if it is off, you know exactly where it is, and you know the hazard that's involved. That again is a slide that Fraser used. I make no apology for repeating it. I think it bears repetition. I think it's made sobering listening when we're hearing Fraser. And very nearly the end of my presentation, can't finish without reminding you to be conscious of biological hazards in the flood water. Leptospirosis, mild symptoms like colds, flu-like symptoms, headaches, chills, etc. But in some cases, as we've heard, it can be much more severe. You have organ failure and internal bleeding, and in rare occasions, death. So, through all of this, I've given you 10 tips for manual handling. I think the number one overarching tip is really to keep out of the flood water, encourage others to warn neighbours and friends if they are venturing in of the hazards, so stay away from the flood water if you possibly can. So I'll stop there and throw it open if there are any questions or other contributions anyone wants to make.